the role of the internet and social media when it comes to social movements and resources for those social movements, and why protesters choose to utilize the internet and social media for certain resources, but not necessarily for others, despite the fact that they may provide those resources. So social media allows for certain things. It allows to mobilize people and resources. So it allows to gain new members as you promote your organization. It allows you to advertise for events that's going to go on. And it allows for things like money to change hands or for people to meet to organize events. It's along with that, as a part of that organizing, when I was looking at research on different social movements, one specifically, Black Lives Matter, has been used the internet where leaders of different Black Lives Matter organizations, so managers of different like town Black Lives Matter organizations or city groups can talk to one another and talk about what events worked for them, what events didn't, which ones were popular, which ones got a lot of just political viewing. But with the movements that I researched, they were all very firm that not everything can be done online. There has to be some point where it transcends into the physical world. And so while social media allows for the rapid dispersal of information and it allows for the creation of democratic debates, social media is commonly used instead of creating these rooms, these spaces for debate. They're instead used to create what are called echo chambers. So echo chambers are where one person says something, and instead of someone feeling like they can disagree, they instead feel like they need to be kept silent to prevent social waves from being created. So putting it into like more common or layperson terms, it prevents unfriending of things like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, like all these different social media platforms. So instead, a person that puts something down instead gets a lot of positive reinforcement. So echo chambers work, one, in making people feel that they're part of something that's actually very popular, while also silencing people that would dispute that. But it also, like I said before, removes the ability for actual debates to happen. And so that also is what can be used to create like these free riders. And that is important when we talked about not everything can be done online. There has to be a physical place, like a protest or a meeting room or a place where things are being prepared for something. So where they're building signage or having conversations. And so the echo chambers where people try to integrate themselves into these social movements also allow for free riders, as some people never actually leave the online sphere. So they stay on their computer and do minimal work to count themselves as a member of that social movement. So what we're going to talk about is how, specifically, not whether or not the internet and social media has been successful, but instead how it's changed. And that's because social media and the internet, it's very hard to pinpoint how and why they're successful because they're used for such different reasons. So to look at this, we're going to look at the pre-internet era, and this is specifically before the internet became popular. So the internet and social media might have been, it might have already been created at this point. But when people didn't really have access to this, when lay people didn't have access to this, this was kind of stuck up to the upper echelons of the government, of academia. So specifically Chile, with the group that we're going to be looking at, they wouldn't have had access to this. And so we're looking at Chile during the Pinochet regime, and we're going to be looking at Arpilleras. And so Arpilleras are Chilean women that come together in these workshops that were created by the Catholic Church, and they come together to create these they're like fabrics, but they're also in part artwork. So they're very similar to like tapestries, and they're called Arpilleras are the tapestries. Arpilleristas are the women that make these tapestries. And so Arpilleras were then sent out and sold in the international sphere. And one, it brought money back into, allowed women to take care of their families. And it also brought international attention to what was going on in Chile at this point. And that's because Arpilleras described things like what it felt like for families of people that had been disappeared, was what they were called. So people that were disappeared persons were people that were kidnapped by the government, and they were tortured, murdered, or people just don't know what happened. So a common thing that happened in Chile during this is that to not have evidence that these crimes were committed, people would be loaded onto airplanes while they were still alive, and then pushed off the plane while they were flying over the Atlantic. So because they were alive and they were still drugged, they were alive when they were last seen, but their bodies would never be found because they were pushed off while they were over the Atlantic. The other thing that these Arpillera workshops did was it started bringing women into politics, which hadn't happened in Chile before this. Women were very much kept inside of the home. They were, it was seen as this thing on when people start talking, they're going to start gossiping. And women were seen as very big, like magpies. And so women were kind of kept inside the house because it prevented them from talking about family secrets, was kind of how things went, but also segregated them from politics. So a lot of these women had no idea what was actually going on in Chile at this time till they started attending these workshops. And so all they knew is their husbands weren't making money. They didn't know why. They thought of their husbands as lazy instead of victims of a regime. The other part of these workshops is that it required trust and in-person communication. So because this regime had spies that went through all levels of society, people that worked for the Catholic Church, specifically the programs were called the Vicaria, they had to talk to people in person. They had to either get friends or friends of friends and acquaintances, and they had to talk to them in person so that person would feel safe enough to actually venture out and do these things. Because putting it into perspective, you've had your family members, because the disappeared were typically men. There were also college students that were disappeared. So you had these family members that were disappeared after speaking out. And so it feels very isolating. So it required this kind of trust to be built very quickly and in person. And then they had to meet at a physical place. So typically it was in the church where these workshops were made, where women would come together and create these areas of debate. But it was guided by the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church wasn't unbiased in itself. It was very similar to how other social movements are, where they're pushing for a specific kind of thought. So now we're going to look into post-internet popularization. So putting it in perspective, the US, about 50% of the population had the internet as of the year 2000. A lot of the world was pretty quick to catch on after that. Hong Kong was one of those. And so Hong Kong will be the case that we're looking at, and specifically Hong Kong during the umbrella movement. So the umbrella movement happened in like the late 2000s to even now in current times. There's parts of the umbrella movement that's still really going on. It doesn't talk about as much, but the actual sit-in happened during 2012. So to do this, we're going to have the post-internet popularization internet users and internet non-users. So our internet users are going to be our university students. We're going to find that this was more heavily researched. University students were seen as the movers and shakers of the umbrella movement, while secondary students are less researched, but this should be something that we should definitely be looking into. But paying it into starting with internet users, university students, as I said, were more heavily researched. They use social media to promote their organization, to contact one another, and they also had a greater ability to promote, even because they weren't controlled by outside people seen as authority, where secondary students were. University students were also able to use the internet to radicalize the international arena, mobilize other Hong Kong students, and communicate with one another. So to do this, a common method of communication was having a yellow umbrella added onto messages if you wanted to mention it as a message for people in the umbrella movement. You could talk to people to promote things, and that's how you mobilize students. And you could radicalize the international arena because they started really using photos, pictures, putting them on social media, became very big on promoting. So they promote themselves as intelligent, very pacifist groups of people. And it was them where they also were able to depict the Hong Kong police as very violent in comparison. They depicted their camps, which were typically like series of tents. They depicted them as places where students were studying, people were getting married. And they also showed themselves as just generally, when I say good people, they took pictures of the umbrellas that were used to protect these students from tear gas, using it, and they were holding it up to protect the police from rain, things like that. Just generally good person things is how they try to promote themselves. Secondary students, on the other hand, they're less researched, and part of that could also be because they were minors at the time this was all going on. They did not have as much freedom to promote. So they had things like parents, because they're underage. They had principals that prevented their promotion in schools, and teachers that also prevented these ways to promoting their organization. You also found less internet use. And so this is important because we're looking at less internet and social media use to promote their organization. And that's because they were able to see these people day in and day out. So if they wanted to talk to someone, they could. While university students, on the other end, their schedules fluctuate more because they're also adults. They don't have these set schedules like high school students did. And social media itself, because less social media internet was used to promote, it was more seen as like a passive way of getting the news. They saw themselves as surrounded by news, seeing news titles, headlines on stands where they're selling newspapers, seeing a couple articles on their social media that they then share with their followers. That's how they kind of saw themselves as collecting news.